Is this proposed legislation that would give a spouse a conditional visa for 2 years, forcing them to live together for that time period, is it a good idea?
That's a really good question. I think it's a complex issue that needs to be looked at in the frame of research that has been done in this area. Over the last 2 years, I've been studying immigration marriage situations across Canada, and I've compared the relationship course and history of situations where there are successful international marriages, where the foreign national stays with the Canadian spouse for at least 5 years after immigration, which is past the time frame for acquiring Canadian citizenship, and also where there's a high level of marital commitment among both partners.
So a real marriage.
A real marriage. And I've compared those situations to the situations where male or female Canadians bring a husband or wife from abroad and that spouse abandons them within prior to the time frame for getting citizenship or after citizenship, right, and looked at what the differences are. And what I see is that in the majority of cases, so 77% of the cases, the foreign nationals left the Canadian marriage partner within a 2-year period.
And then do they leave the country? Or?
And they intended to sponsor another spouse from their country of origin who was their coexisting boyfriend or girlfriend simultaneously with the marriage to come to Canada, which is fraud.
77%.
77%. And the average length of time they stayed with the Canadian marriage partners was only 19 months.
Wow.
And during that period, the Canadian marriage partners, whether they're male or female, made different kinds of discoveries of those coexisting relationships. So maybe the person left the internet on and they caught messages on MSN Messenger. Maybe they discovered pictures in their luggage or so on. So on the one hand, we can think that are we tying people who may be in a relationship that's not going well into a trapped situation where they have to stay with the Canadian marriage partner for 2 years? But on the other hand, if we don't leave enough time to actually see how the relationship plays out after a couple is unified, we won't be able to assess and detect fraud situations, because the Canadian immigration system only enters the relationship after the marriage has already taken place.
Right. So you're worried about the 23% that are legitimate?
Yes.
Raj, critics are concerned that forcing people to live together for 2 years before that citizenship is granted could cause harm, particularly to women in abusive relationships. The man who's the abuser not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think that this marriage so-called crackdown is actually a specious crackdown. I mean, it looks like it's a good idea, but in reality, it's not a good idea. And I appreciate that Professor Merali has done some research in this area, but I think that research is going to fall on deaf ears because this government tends to reject evidence-based decision-making. Now, the problem is this, is that when you require immigration, when you require a couple to be together for 2 years, there's a power imbalance. There's this dynamic. And you are going to force individuals to stay in abusive relationships. And that's wrong. And here's the situation. Again, this government doesn't like evidence-based decision-making, and it also doesn't like giving discretion to decision makers. So what really has to be done is enforcing the existing legislation. I think that this is a bad idea, and this is offered up as a this is simply offered up to Minister Kenney's core constituents that want something to be done on fraud and immigration, whether that something is actually will legitimately help or not.
Noorfarah, you actually have been asked by people in Ottawa to tell them more about your research here based in Alberta.
Yes, and I want to respond to Raj's comment as well about the abuse and address this issue, because it's a really legitimate issue. We do know that when there is a conditional permanent residence period, which is the current U.S. policy, there is a heightened vulnerability of women to domestic violence and being trapped in those situations, because making them dependent on the sponsor for all their basic needs for that 3-year period and not have any kind of social safety net outside the family makes it difficult for them to have anyone to go to, and they're often threatened to be deported, and this would make those threats very real.
And if it's a Canadian woman who's brought a man in, same situation.
Same situation. So what I would say in relation to that is all of how these situations would be dealt with depend on how the policy is implemented. Currently, the visa officers assess situations and the authenticity of the marriage in the foreign country prior to the foreign spouse's arrival in Canada. Canada. And under this new policy, there would be a reassessment after 2 years. The policy needs to have a provision in it that when there is abuse being reported by the sponsored person, that reassessment can be called at an earlier interval, and that all the women being brought into Canada as foreign spouses are given at least one settlement or immigration agency connection, so they have a social safety net outside of the family they're entering in the event of these risks.
Sounds like a good practical idea. Wow. And Raj, the problem maybe is as you say, we've got laws right now. You're dealing with cases that are 10 years old and still aren't being managed.
Well, my response to Professor Merali is simply that battered women who already are Canadian citizens or are born and raised here, battered women don't go to the authorities. So we're going to expect newly arrived immigrant women who may have English as a second language or are not proficient in the English language to actually go forward to the authorities themselves. That doesn't seem reasonable. And in terms of the implementation, how are we going to implement? Because, as Jennifer said, I've got cases where they're investigating my client from a marriage which is alleged that was fraudulent, that occurred 10 years ago. And so you have CBSA in this position of having tens of thousands of individuals that are in Canada without status. CBSA can't even deport those people. CBSA can't deport my clients that have been here for 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Canada Border Services you're talking about?
Exactly. And so, you know, again, this is a nice idea. It's obviously it's something that's been offered or proffered by Minister Kennedy to his core constituents, but I don't believe that it can be implemented.
Okay. I'm going to let you respond in just one moment, because next we want to hear from Noorfarah again. And how prevalent is immigration marriage fraud here in Alberta? Do we need a crackdown by government? What should it look like? Tell us what you think, too. Follow the contact links on albertaprimetime.com.
Fact is, this is always going to be evident. This is always going to exist. This is a media scare. This is media presenting it to problems of the government. When you have a bureaucracy, when you have an infrastructure this big and a country that's one of the most biggest